guys, sorry I can't be there today, but to make up for it, instead of just having you flip through this PowerPoint on your own, I decided to go ahead and record myself talking through it, just in case for some reason my voice helps you in remembering some of the things that we talk about. So here is chapter 12, which is all about territorial and economic expansion. The first big thing that I need to talk to you about is manifest destiny. You probably remember hearing this before, but manifest destiny is the belief that the United States has a divine mission to extend its power and civilization across North America. So you can see that really by this point in time, the United States is made up with the brown, that is all of the kind of state created stuff, but then also we have at this point the Louisiana Purchase. So all this other land right now we don't have, but by the end of our PowerPoint today we will basically have all of that. Really the big reason why Manifest Destiny is happening in such large amounts during this time is nationalism, so very pro-America feeling. We want to become bigger and larger and more powerful. We also have population increase going on, so having more land means more room for that population to spread out. We also have a lot of economic development happening, which means we need, resources. And then technological advances as well, things like the railroad make it easier for us to go west, as well as some of our reforms. So obviously some of our reformers that we've already mentioned really want their own space, their own area, and in order to do that, we got to spread out. Now, we do have some northern critics of expansion because they feel like the main reason that we're expanding is actually to expand slavery. Now, obviously, there would be some northerners who are okay with expansion, but most of these critics of expansion happen to be northern because they view it as a reason for slavery or a way for slavery to expand, okay? So, one of the places or, big players that we're going to butt heads with is actually going to be Mexico. So Mexico, the last time we talked about them, were under Spanish control, but Mexico gains its independence from Spain in about 1820. Shockingly, we actually have a lot of Americans who moved to Mexico, specifically this area of Mexico we know today as Texas. And they're also illegal immigrants because they're choosing not to follow Mexico's laws, specifically their rules of citizenship, which are to take an oath of allegiance to Mexico and also to convert to Catholicism. And a lot of these Americans that are moving to Mexico aren't Catholic and don't want to change their religion. So yes, a lot of these people are deciding to go into Texas, a part of Mexico, and not really following the rules while they're there. Now, the Mexican government is okay with this a little bit because they don't really have a whole lot of people settled in this area. So there's very few actual Mexican people living in Texas. There are some, but just a very little amount. So the people who are in Texas, these American people who have now settled there, disagree a lot with the Mexican government, obviously with things like oaths of allegiance and with religion. But Mexico also wants to limit how many Americans can come in to Texas. And it's like, if I've just moved and I'm trying to bring my whole family here, then I'm gonna want them to be able to bring my family into this area that I've just moved to. So that's another area of disagreement. And then the other really big area of disagreement is on slavery. Mexico has actually already outlawed slavery, and obviously a lot of these Americans that are moving into Texas are bringing the slaves with them because a lot of them do tend to be from the South, okay? So that means that there's going to be a lot of issues that you can already tell that these Texans are upset about, and they actually decide that they would rather govern themselves than be, left to be ruled by Mexico. So there is going to be a rebellion. Stephen Austin, who you can see up here, his lovely portrait there, is going to lead the rebellion against Mexico. So he was an American. He moved into Texas, which is controlled by Mexico. So because of how unhappy the Texans are, they're going to fight. So he's going to be the leader. The leader on the Mexican side is a general named Antonio Santa Anna. And so he is actually one of the biggest generals in the military at this time. He actually is going to end up leading Mexico itself. He, military general dictatorship kind of style. So he's the one leading the Mexican army against this rebellion. So you have our Texans and we have our Mexican army that are going to be fighting so that Texas is going to get independent. So the Texans actually end up pushing the Mexican army out of Texas. So even though they are a small force, they are a mighty force, and they are able to be pretty successful. One of the areas that one of the largest battles of the Texan War for Independence is actually going to happen at the Alamo. So there are a lot of Texan soldiers that are stationed here at the Alamo. I know we always see this picture and think, oh, it's just a building. It's actually like an entire little town. So there are literally thousands of Texans, men, women, children, young, old, that are here at the Alamo. Some of it's for their own protection, and then obviously for some of the soldiers, it's, they're supposed to protect this area and all the citizens that are inside. But the General Santa Anna, who we just mentioned, is going to march to the Alamo. There's going to be a fight that happens there that lasts for about 11 days. It's kind of considered a siege because the Mexican army is just continuing to do as much damage to the Alamo as they can. And the Americans inside are actually massacred, okay? I said Americans, remember they're Americans. They kind of want to create their own country. A little bit of a weird situation, right? This is actually where the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," is created. So we say that today, or we've heard that, but it was intended to be used as a battle cry, like a reason to get people excited about going to war. So that is one of the big battles. The second battle is actually, turned the other way for the war, and that's the Battle of San Jacinto. I know that my Spanish is not very good. I'm sorry about that. But the Mexicans at this point are caught off guard and are actually ambushed. And so in that ambush, our General Santa Anna from the Mexican army actually gets captured. So Santa Anna is forced to surrender because, he's been captured and all. And so Mexico ends up surrendering to, at this point, Sam Houston, because our old friend Mr. Austin had been killed. So Sam Houston becomes the first leader of the independent country of Texas. So, a little bit about Texas as we keep chugging along here. Very surprisingly, these Americans who had left and are now in their own country would actually rather have Texas just become part of the United States. While that's kind of being debated and talked about, Texas is under the presidency of Sam Houston, who we mentioned earlier. By the way, in case you don't know this, Houston, really big city in Texas, all that fun stuff. Texas is struggling, okay? They are mostly farmers, plantation owners, that kind of thing going on. So they're not really creating a very self-sufficient economy. So financially, they realize this would be better for us if we were to be part of the United States. You can kind of see from the map here that Texas is a little bit larger than we think of Texas today. Now, Mexico is already really mad that they have lost Texas, but they're also kind of trying to make sure that the United States doesn't become even more powerful. So Mexico actually warns the United States to not annex Texas. Basically, they're trying to say if you do take over Texas, then there will be war. So they've given us a little bit of warning. We'll find out that, we don't really tend to listen to warnings. The Northerners are actually not really too willing to annex Texas because remember that a lot of the people who moved into Texas were Southerners. So if we add Texas into the Union, it's more than likely going to become another slave state. And even if you make Texas smaller and break it up, then you're adding several new slave states. So yeah, not something that Northerners would be happy about. Now, the United States is going to annex Texas anyway in 1845. So obviously lots of arguments are happening about this between the U.S. and Mexico inside the United States, but we're still going to annex Texas. Now, before we really dive into the tension that we can already see brewing between us and Mexico, we have a couple other things to talk about. The first thing is some other boundary disputes, because it's not just between us and Mexico that there are issues happening. We also have some issues happening between us and Canada, which is still under British rule at this time, just in case you were unsure of that. So really a couple different places, and the maps here are going to help you. So between Maine and Canada, there is a very fishy border of we're not really sure. We claim one thing, Canada claims another. It's actually going to result in some fighting, which is known as the Aroostook War. So that's one point of contention. The other point of contention is over here in at the point at that point is Minnesota territory. It will become the state of Minnesota. But the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842 is actually going to settle both of these boundaries to what they are today. So if you look at the map, you can see kind of where Maine ends up being and where Minnesota ends up going out to. Okay? Now, the other place, which isn't on this map, but I have it on the bottom one, that we're arguing about with Canada/Britain is Oregon Territory, okay? Now, when I say Oregon today, we all know, all right, that's just like this random square state that's north of California, but actually that whole, like, northwestern part of the United States was Oregon Territory, okay? It eventually gets divided up into the different territories that become states. But the one thing that we're kind of unsure about is where the actual boundary should be. So you might be able to tell from this border, or from this map down here, that the United States actually wants that border to be way up here at 5440, which would kind of actually connect us with the very bottom end of Alaska, okay? And then the Canadians/the British would prefer if that line were at 42 degrees. These are our lines of latitude. So that is where they would prefer it to be. So you can see that's quite a big difference between the two. We're honestly ready to go to war about it. In fact, there is the slogan 5440 or fight, because we are ready to fight about this. But at the time that we're ready to fight about this, we're also ready to fight Mexico. So, you know, it's hard to be fighting two different wars at the same time. So instead, we actually agree to divide basically the difference. And so the territory becomes divided at the 49th parallel, which is the parallel that we very famously know today as the border between the United States and Canada. Obviously not for the entire border, because things get a little bit weird down up here that you can see in this map, but for the very, straight part out west, it is all along the 49th parallel. Now, the government agrees to this, obviously, even though there are people there wanting more, but again, we got some issues brewing with Mexico very, very soon. Now, before we actually get to that tension with Mexico, we do have a change in leadership we need to discuss, which happens in 1844. So the Democrats are going to nominate a man named James Polk. He's a relatively unknown politician from the state of Tennessee who favors westward expansion. So obviously westward expansion becomes a very big deal, and especially because of, gaining Texas and all that stuff. The Whigs are going to nominate our old friend Henry Clay from Kentucky, who honestly flip-flops back and forth whether he supports or doesn't support expansion. So he's kind of a confusing guy. The Liberty Party, which is actually a third party that's created at this time, is also going to be running for presidency at this point, and they're going to take some votes away from the Whigs. But the thing about the Liberty Party is that they're a party with really only one goal, and that is anti-slavery, okay? Which we're going to see that happening a little bit more during this time frame, that we'll see random little, third parties popping up, but they're literally a one issue party. Like, they only have thoughts on this one issue. Now, Polk is going to win this election. You can see him down there, and you can see on the map he is the blue. They're very, very close when we are looking at the popular vote, but the electoral college vote you can see is much more heavily blue here. All right? So that is leading us into war with Mexico, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to make a second video for you.